The smoke in the bar was stinging Jerry's eyes. He rubbed them and took another sip of his beer. It was growing warm. He looked at the glass and felt disgusted. All these people here, all paired off, were in small groups, but yet he was alone. He felt a little lonely and decided to strike up a conversation with the guy on his left. He turned and looked at him, but he took no notice. He had a faraway look in his eyes, lost in thought. He watched his neighbor for a bit, and then noticed he was wearing a cross around his neck. He chuckled quietly for a moment. A Christian? In a bar? This was rich. Jerry elbowed his neighbor gently. "Hey," he said gently. "I couldn't help but notice you're wearing a cross. Why do you wear it? What made you become a Christian? Or is this some kind of gift you feel obligated to wear?" The man looked down at the floor, or perhaps his shoes, for a moment. He took a deep breath, and then looked back for 2 or 3 seconds at Jerry. There was an uncomfortable silence for a moment. Jerry started to think perhaps the man didn't speak English all that well, but then he spoke. "I used to be a prison guard with the army," he said matter-of-factly. "I worked for 3 years at a prison in Iraq. It was all a huge, ridiculous political mess. I'm sure there were terrorists there somewhere, but I never seemed to have any under my supervision. They were all taxi drivers, barbers, restaurateurs, a tailor once." He took a deep breath and then looked at the floor for a moment. The tailor. His voice trailed off. Jerry asked, "Don't tell me some tailor in Iraq, in a prison no less, guided you to Jesus?" The man looked back at Jerry, and there was a little bit of annoyance in his eyes. Then his eyes grew softer, and he started to look a little deeper into Jerry, making him feel a little bit uncomfortable. The man started again. "Help me to find Jesus?" Maybe he did. Maybe he did at that. He took a deep pull off a cigarette Jerry hadn't noticed before, and then stubbed it out in the ashtray, and then started to tell Jerry a story. "We interviewed terrorists, or at least terror suspects. A lot of it ended up being political garbage. Some of those families over there have feuds lasting 700 years, and that's the honest truth. They used us to take their rival families out of competition, and then those families retaliate by telling us that so-and-so's restaurant is a headquarters for the underground terror group. We close the restaurant and arrest everybody, and eventually they confess to all kinds of crimes, but of course we're far from the real terror groups. Once we had this tailor in custody, and we were interviewing him for maybe the 20th time. He finally looked up in his chair and he looked at me, like I'm looking at you, just not saying anything for maybe a minute. We're asking him about some guy that we suspected of having connections to the terror groups that was seen in his shop, but he's not responding to any of our questions. He just says, out of the blue, "Do you know why you have no windows here?" I didn't know what to say to that. He really kind of surprised us. He said, "Because deep down you know what you're doing is wrong. You cannot tell your wife or your son what you do each day because you know it's wrong. You feel shame for what you're doing. You do not want people to see, people to know what you do here because you know you're wrong in doing it. I don't have fear here because I know I've done no wrong. I can easily discuss everything I did every day with my wife or my son. I had a lot of windows in my shop because I was at ease with people seeing me do my job. This wrong that you feel, it will weigh on you like chains. You're making your own chains in your job here, day by day. You think that this prison is for me, but you're wrong. I'm free," he pointed to his head, "in here. But you are the ones in prison," he pointed to our heads, "in there. Someday we will all face judgment before God. I know you believe this. Even if you do not acknowledge it out loud, every human knows that God is real. I'm fine with facing God and facing my judgment, because everything I did was in the open, in the light of day, in front of people, and in front of God. You need to open the windows, not here in the prison, but inside your heads, inside your soul. You need to think about God. I really didn't know how to respond. My coworker began asking him questions again, but his voice suddenly seemed far away. The tailor was watching me, like he was really close to me, like I am to you. And the man that I sat right beside seemed to drift like on a river, far, far away, his voice fading. But the tailor's voice was quite clear. You may not know this, but in the bombing of our neighborhood, my wife was killed. It was a terrible shock to me and my son, but I soon got over it. She visits me, you see, in my sleep, and sometimes, even when I'm awake, I can feel her presence. One dream I had was of the first few minutes of my death. When I die, I will go through a darkness, a frightening black, and I will be falling uncontrollably. But then I will see a light. I will fall into this light, and it will become a beach. Behind the beach, as far as you can see, there are trees and green hills in the distance, a huge forest, not dark and scary, but bright and green and welcoming. On the beach is my wife, spinning, her skirt twirling out as she spins, looking up at me as I'm falling to her. I slow in my fall and land on my feet, and she runs to me, grasping my hands, and she's laughing. And her eyes go up to the side for a moment like this, as she's thinking of so many things she needs to tell me. And she takes a breath and begins to say something, and I wake up. And that's the dream I have. You see, I have no fear of death. I've seen it a dozen times. You cannot frighten me with beatings or torture, because there's nothing frightening waiting for me. Can you say the same? Think of what you do every day. Can you face God? Does the idea of dying fill you with calm or with fear? You need to think of these things. He then gave me a calm smile, almost like he was reassuring me. And I woke up. I had dreamed the whole crazy thing. I was relieved it was only a dream, because it was really unnerving. It was intense. I was sweating when I woke up. Well, I was sweating when I woke up all the time when I was in Iraq. But this was different. I felt something had changed. Something had kind of shifted inside me. I took a shower and I shaved, but I still felt different. A little shaky. A little shaken. A little unsure. It's hard to describe. But when I went back to the cell block, I discovered the body bag guys were there, taking out a prisoner. Someone had died in the night. They were still writing something on a clipboard as they wheeled him right past me. It was that tailor. He had died in the night. And on his face was that same exact expression that he'd given me in my dream. That same kind of pitiful smile, like it was his job to help me. That really shook me up. I did not sign up for re-enlistment when my term came up, even though there was a big bonus. I just quit. I quit it all and I went back home. I went to my church first thing, and when I saw the pastor, I told him I needed to talk to him. Man, I cried like a little girl in his office. He told me to come to church as much as I could, and to wear this cross outside my clothes, and it'll help. And it does, for the most part. He took a drink, and then he took another, finishing his glass. Suddenly, Jerry was aware a man was standing behind him, uncomfortably close, almost bumping into him. The man was looking at his phone, but suddenly looked up. "I'm sorry, I couldn't help but overhear a little of your story. It just struck me as so odd. I don't know how to start, so let me just show you this." He held up his cell phone, and Jerry and his neighbor looked at it. It was a news article about a tourist that had been held captive on an island in the Philippines by Muslim terrorists for almost 2 years, but he'd escaped. "This was me," he said, gesturing to his phone. "But I didn't escape. You see, I got to know one of my captors. He was a really nice older guy. He had 2 kids, but somehow he'd gotten roped into helping this terror cell. He was a Muslim guy. But one day he was talking to me. It was a little cold and rainy, and he's sitting inside my cell after bringing me food, and I'm eating the food. And he's just sitting there talking to me, and he's so curious about why I showed so little fear. And I told him that I had lost my wife in 2007, and that she visited me from time to time. I'd seen her in my dreams, and I'd felt her presence during the day. And I had seen the first few minutes of my death. I would be falling and afraid in this blackness, but then I would fall onto a beach, and there on the beach was my wife spinning and laughing." Jerry and his neighbor were listening, and Jerry suddenly realized his mouth was open. His eyes met his neighbor's eyes for a moment, and then they turned back to the man as he continued. "She would take my hand and almost speak, and then she would disappear, and I would wake up. And I told him I didn't fear death because I was unafraid of judgment. I'd never done evil to another man. I told him I felt sorry for him because I knew he wasn't able to talk freely with his wife and his son about what he did with this group. If you can't talk to your wife and your son freely about what you do, how will you face judgment when you stand before God?" The man grew really quiet, and he grew a little angry, and he stormed out of my cell, and I didn't see him for maybe 3 days after that. But one night, in the middle of the night, he shook me awake. He dragged me out of the cell, and he put me quickly in a taxi that was waiting outside. He said something to the taxi driver, and away we went. I was taken straight to the police station. I was safe. I told the police I'd escaped to try to save him from being killed by that crazy group. Anyway, that's how I became a Christian. And it really struck me as so odd, the similarities with his story. It just seemed so odd. The man laughed a little, and then smiled, looking at Jerry's neighbor. And then he and Jerry's neighbor both looked at Jerry. And they said, almost together, "Why aren't you a Christian?" Suddenly Jerry woke up, sat up, bolt upright in bed, breathing hard. "My goodness," he said out loud. "What a crazy dream.